The screaming stopped at precisely 4:47 in the morning. Ezekiel Crane knew this because he had been counting the lashes, 37 in total, and tracking the rhythm of Cyrus Whitlock's agony against the mechanical certainty of his own heartbeat. Standing on the third floor of Dunridge Mill, hammer gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone the color of old ivory, Ezekiel watched through the window as two field hands dragged Cyrus's limp body across the frost-hardened ground toward the quarters. The man's back looked like plowed earth, raw and glistening in the torchlight. Bartholomew Grissom stood in the courtyard below, coiling his whip with the casual satisfaction of a man who had just completed routine maintenance. His breath plumed in the November cold. He said something to Amos Pritchard, the second overseer, and they both laughed, a sound that carried up through the pre-dawn darkness and settled into Ezekiel's bones like splinters. Cyrus's crime had been looking Grissom in the eye. 3 seconds of direct eye contact. 3 seconds that had cost him consciousness and possibly his life. Ezekiel positioned the nail against the window frame with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. The nail was 7 inches long, forged iron, thick as his little finger. He had selected it specifically for this purpose from among the hundreds of nails in his workshop. This nail would not bend. This nail would not pull free easily. This nail was the first word in a sentence only he could read. The hammer rose. The hammer fell. The sound of iron driving through wood was swallowed by the mill's perpetual thunder, the clatter of 143 looms running their ceaseless pattern, the grinding of drive shafts, the rhythmic percussion of shuttles flying back and forth in their races. The mill never slept. The mill never stopped. The mill devoured cotton and human hours with equal appetite and produced cloth that would be sold to men who had never set foot in South Carolina, who would never know the cost of each thread. Ezekiel drove a second nail through the top of the window sash, then a third along the side. He worked with methodical efficiency, each strike of the hammer deliberate and controlled. To any observer, he was simply securing a loose window against the coming winter. The mill was old, built in 1809, and required constant maintenance. Ezekiel, as the property's only skilled carpenter, was responsible for keeping the massive structure from collapsing under its own hungry weight. But Ezekiel was not repairing this window. He was sealing it shut. Permanently. For more nails along the bottom sash. 3 along the sides. The window, which had once opened to allow air circulation during the suffocating summer months, would never open again. He ran his calloused fingers along the frame, testing his work. Perfect. The sash was now part of the frame, as immobile as the stone foundation beneath the building. Below, Grissom and Pritchard had disappeared back into the overseer's house, a tidy structure of whitewashed wood that stood in grotesque contrast to the sagging quarters where 57 enslaved souls slept in spaces meant for half that number. Ezekiel descended from the stool he had been standing on and examined his work from a distance. In the weak light filtering through the sealed window, no one would notice what he had done. The nails were barely visible against the dark wood of the frame. It looked like craftsmanship. It looked like care. It was a coffin nail. "You're up early." Ezekiel turned slowly, his face carefully arranged into the expressionless mask he had perfected over his 31 years of bondage. Delphine Merriweather stood at the top of the narrow stairs, a basket of cotton waste balanced against her hip. She was 42 years old and had been at Dunridge Mill since childhood, her hands permanently bent into claws from decades of working the looms. Her eyes, however, remained sharp as broken glass. "Loose window," Ezekiel said, his voice low and flat. Grissom wanted it fixed before the cold set in properly. Delphine moved past him to her station, loom number 47, third row from the north wall. She set down her basket and began the process of loading fresh cotton into the machine's hungry mouth. But her eyes flickered to the window, then back to Ezekiel, and in that glance he saw a question forming. "Seems awful secure now," she said quietly. "Almost like it wasn't meant to open again." Ezekiel said nothing. He gathered his tools, hammer, nail bag, measuring square, and prepared to leave. The day's shift would begin in 13 minutes, and he needed to be elsewhere when the flood of workers arrived. He had learned long ago that the safest place for a man like him was in motion, appearing busy, essential but unremarkable. "Cyrus going to live?" he asked, though he was not certain he wanted the answer. "Don't know yet. They got him in the quarters with old Temperance tending him." Delphine's hands moved through the cotton with practiced speed, her fingers dancing around the machinery's metal teeth. All because he forgot to look down fast enough. The man's back is ribbons for 3 seconds of looking. Ezekiel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 seconds. He had counted each one while standing at this very window, watching chrism work with the methodical enthusiasm of a craftsman who took pride in his trade. Best get to work, Ezekiel said. Pritchard will be making rounds soon. He moved toward the stairs, but Delphine's voice stopped him. Ezekiel. She did not turn from her loom, but her words cut through the mechanical din with surprising clarity. Whatever you're planning, whatever that window is about, you be careful. A man gets ideas in his head, sometimes those ideas become his last thought. Ezekiel descended the stairs without responding. The mill's first floor stretched before him like the interior of some industrial cathedral, vast, shadowed, choked with the floating lint that gave the air a dreamlike quality. Except this was no dream. This was Dunridge Mill, owned and operated by Silas Dunridge, a man who had never touched a loom in his life but understood profit margins with the devotion other men reserved for scripture. The mill measured 160 feet long and 70 feet wide, 4 stories of brick and timber and cotton dust. Ezekiel knew every beam, every joist, every load-bearing wall. He had repaired them all countless times. He knew where the structure was strong and where it was weak. He knew which doors could be forced and which were iron reinforced. He knew the location of every window, every ventilation shaft, every possible exit. And over the past month, he had been mapping something else, a plan that lived in the architecture itself, invisible to everyone except him. His workshop occupied a corner of the first floor, tucked behind the raw cotton storage area. It was perhaps the only space in the entire mill that belonged to him in any meaningful way. Here, among the workbenches and tools that had been his constant companions for 16 years, Ezekiel could almost pretend he was a craftsman rather than property valued at $800 in Silas Dunridge's ledger. He had learned his trade from a free black carpenter named Solomon Hayes in Charleston, back before Ezekiel had been sold south to pay his previous owner's gambling debts. Solomon had been a master craftsman, capable of creating furniture so fine that wealthy white families competed for his work. He had taught Ezekiel that carpentry was not merely about joining wood, it was about understanding stress and weight, about reading grain patterns like language, about building things that would outlast their creators. A building remembers what you put into it, Solomon had told him once, running his hand along a perfect mortise and tenon joint. You build with anger, it'll be weak. You build with care, it'll stand forever. But you build with purpose, boy, with real purpose, and that building becomes something else entirely. Becomes a statement. Ezekiel was building a statement. He set his tools on the workbench and retrieved a small leather-bound notebook from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The notebook was forbidden, enslaved people were not permitted to read or write, but Ezekiel had learned anyway, taught by Solomon during those precious years of apprenticeship. In the notebook, rendered in careful architectural sketches, was a map of Dunridge Mill showing every window. He made a small mark next to the third-floor north window. 1 down. 83 to go. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor made him close the notebook quickly and slide it back into its hiding place. Amos Pritchard appeared in the workshop doorway, his bulk blocking most of the weak morning light. Pritchard was 28 years old, massive as a draft horse, and cruel in the casual way of men who have been given authority over other human beings without any corresponding burden of empathy. Crane, Pritchard said, his voice carrying the thick accent of the South Carolina Low Country. Mr. Dunridge wants you up at the big house. Says there's a banister coming loose in the main hall. Ezekiel nodded, gathering the tools he would need. Pritchard did not move from the doorway. Heard you were up early, Pritchard continued, picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. Fixing windows in the dark. Is that true? Chrism wanted it done before the day's shift, Ezekiel replied, his voice carefully neutral. Didn't want cold air affecting the workers' productivity. Pritchard grunted, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Well, get on up to the house then. And Crane. Don't take all day. Got a list of repairs as long as my arm that needs doing. That cotton press in the warehouse is acting up again, and 2 of the looms on the second floor are running rough. Yes sir. Ezekiel waited for Pritchard to leave, then followed at a respectful distance. The overseer headed toward the overseer's house while Ezekiel turned toward the main plantation house, a grand structure of columns and verandas that sat on a rise overlooking the mill like a white-painted judge presiding over a courtroom. The walk took him past the quarters where Cyrus Whitlock lay bleeding, past the punishment post where the whipping had occurred, past the cotton press and the gin house and all the other structures that comprised Silas Dunridge's empire of cloth and human misery. The sun was beginning to rise now, painting the sky the color of old bruises. Inside his chest, beneath the careful mask of compliance he wore like a second skin, Ezekiel felt something cold and precise taking shape. It was not rage was hot and impulsive and got you killed. What Ezekiel felt was more like the patience of winter ice forming over a deep river, beautiful and deadly and inevitable. He thought about the sealed window. The first of many. Each one a nail in a coffin he was building board by board, window by window, with all the skill Solomon Hayes had taught him. A building remembers what you put into it. Dunridge Mill was going to remember Ezekiel Crane. He adjusted the tool bag on his shoulder and climbed the steps to the big house, his face empty of everything except dutiful purpose. Behind him, the mill roared its endless hunger, consuming cotton and hours in equal measure, unaware that its own carpenter was slowly, methodically, transforming it into something else entirely. Into a tomb. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands, precious, impossible to hold, marked only by the accumulation of sealed windows and whispered conspiracies. Ezekiel had closed 17 windows across the mill's 4 floors, working in careful patterns that suggested nothing more than routine winterization. He sealed 2 on the first floor near the cotton press, 3 on the second floor where the spinning frames rattled in their wooden housings, 5 on the third floor among the looms, and 7 on the fourth floor in the unused storage areas where broken machinery went to rust in darkness. Each window received the same meticulous attention, nails driven at precise intervals, the work disguised as maintenance rather than entombment. No one noticed. Or rather, no one who noticed cared enough to question the carpenter's methods. Bartholomew Grissom had walked past 4 sealed windows without comment, his attention focused on productivity quotas and the systematic brutalization of anyone whose output fell below his expectations. Silas Dunridge himself had stood before a sealed third-floor window during his weekly inspection, nodding approvingly at what he perceived as Ezekiel's thoroughness in preparing the mill for winter. "Good work, Crane," he had said, his fingers drumming against the immobile window frame. "Can't have cold drafts slowing production." Ezekiel had bowed his head in acknowledgement, his face arranged in the same blank expression he wore like armor, while inside his chest something dark and patient counted down toward December. The revolt had been brewing since August, long before Ezekiel conceived his architectural vengeance. It had started with Tobias Ashford, a 23-year-old field hand who possessed the dangerous combination of literacy and hope. Tobias had learned to read from a sympathetic tutor during his childhood in Charleston, before being sold south to Dunridge's plantation at age 16. He had spent the intervening years carefully, quietly gathering information about the network of abolitionists operating throughout South Carolina and into North Carolina. The meetings happened in the mill's basement, in a cramped space behind the coal storage where the furnace that powered the steam engine belched heat and covered the sound of conspiratorial voices. They met in groups of no more than 6, rotating participants to avoid suspicion, always at different times, always with lookouts posted. On the 23rd night of November, Ezekiel descended into that basement darkness to find Tobias, Delphine Merriweather, Miriam Blackwell, and Josiah Thorne waiting among the cold dust and shadows. Miriam worked in the main house as a chambermaid, which gave her access to information and supplies the others could not obtain. She was 34 years old, light-skinned enough that some mistook her for white in dim light, which she used to her advantage when moving through spaces where darker faces drew immediate suspicion. Josiah was the strongest man on the plantation, a former blacksmith who had been purchased specifically for his ability to repair the mill's machinery. His hands could bend iron bars and crush walnuts without effort, but his real strength lay in his quiet certainty that freedom was worth any cost. "We're set for December 3rd, Tobias said without preamble. His voice was low but carried an edge of barely contained excitement. "New moon. The Quaker family 30 miles north, the Harrisons, they'll have wagons waiting in the pine forest past Crowley's Creek. We move at midnight, take what supplies we can carry, and we run." Delphine shook her head slowly. "Running means leaving people behind. Children. The elderly. Anyone too sick or scared to move fast. We run, and Dunridge brings in dogs and militia. We'll be lucky if half of us see dawn." "Then what do you suggest?" Josiah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew Delphine's answer. "We stay here and die slowly instead of dying fast. I suggest," Delphine said, her bent fingers folding together like broken wings, that we consider what Ezekiel's been doing these past weeks. All eyes turned to the carpenter. Ezekiel stood with his back against the coal-blackened wall, his face half illuminated by the single candle Miriam had brought. For a long moment, he said nothing, measuring the weight of words against the weight of windows sealed shut. "I've closed 17 windows," he finally said. "By December 3rd, I'll have 60 sealed. Maybe more." Tobias frowned. "What does that?" "Every exit controlled," Ezekiel continued, his voice flat and terrible in its calmness. "Every ventilation point is blocked. Every escape route is mapped and ready to be locked down. The mill becomes a box. A sealed box with everyone inside." The silence that followed was broken only by the furnace's hungry roar. "You mean to trap them," Miriam said slowly, realization dawning in her eyes. "The overseers. Dunridge. You mean to trap them inside with us?" "No." Ezekiel's gaze moved from face to face, letting them see something he usually kept buried beneath layers of protective servility. "I mean to trap them inside while we decide whether to leave. The choice becomes ours. Not theirs. For once, we control the doors." Josiah leaned forward, his massive frame blocking the candlelight. "And if fire breaks out in a sealed building? If smoke fills the floors with nowhere to go? Then everyone faces the same fate," Ezekiel replied. "Master and slave alike. Equal in the dark." The horror of it settled over them like a funeral shroud. This was not a plan for escape. This was a plan for mutual destruction, for dragging their oppressors down into whatever hell awaited, for ensuring that if freedom was impossible, then at least revenge was guaranteed. "That's murder," Tobias whispered, though his voice carried no judgment, only stunned recognition. "That's murdering ourselves along with them. That's ensuring they can't escape what they've built," Ezekiel corrected. "This mill is their fortune. Their pride. Let it become their tomb. And if we choose to walk out those doors before the end, we walk out knowing they can't follow. Knowing they're sealed inside the thing they used to cage us." Delphine studied Ezekiel with eyes that had seen 3 decades of suffering and somehow retained the capacity for sharp assessment. "You've been planning this since Cyrus was whipped." "I've been planning this since I was sold away from Charleston 16 years ago," Ezekiel said quietly. "Since the first time chrism struck me for moving too slow. Every morning I woke up in chains and went to sleep in chains, and the only thing I owned was the knowledge in my head and the skill in my hands. I'm using both now. Using them to build something that matters. If you're captivated by this dark tale of vengeance and the brutal realities of 1834 South Carolina, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below." Miriam broke the heavy silence. "I can get lamp oil from the house. Silas keeps gallons of it in the storage room off the kitchen. Temperance, his wife, she never goes down there. Too worried about her dresses getting dirty. I can secure the tools we'll need," Josiah added, his voice taking on a grim determination. "Hammers, axes, anything that can be used as weapon or to force our way out if we need to. Hide them in different locations throughout the mill. And I'll coordinate the others," Tobias said. "Carefully. Only those we trust absolutely. We tell them there's a plan, but we don't tell them everything until the night itself. Too many people knowing too much is how rebellions get discovered before they begin." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "December 3rd. 22 days from now. I'll have the mill ready. The windows sealed, the exit points identified and prepared. When midnight comes, we lock the doors from the inside. We control who leaves and who stays. We decide." "And Cyrus?" Delphine asked. "He's still recovering. His back is infected. He can barely walk. We carry him," Josiah said simply. "We don't leave our people behind. That's what separates us from them." The meeting dispersed in carefully staggered intervals, each person leaving the basement separately to avoid suspicion. Ezekiel remained behind, staring into the furnace's orange glow. The heat reminded him of Charleston summers, of working in Solomon Hayes's workshop with the doors open to catch the breeze, of a time when carpentry had been a craft rather than a weapon. You build with purpose, boy, and that building becomes something else entirely. Becomes a statement. Solomon's words echoed in the coal-dust darkness. Ezekiel wondered what his old mentor would think of the statement he was building now. Would Solomon approve of turning architectural skill into systematic vengeance? Or would he see it as a corruption of everything carpentry was meant to represent? It didn't matter. Solomon was free, living somewhere in the north if he still lived at all. Ezekiel was here, in Dunridge Mill, surrounded by sealed windows and accumulating rage and the mechanical thunder of looms that never stopped their hungry consumption. He climbed the basement stairs and emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of the mill floor. The looms clattered their eternal rhythm, tended by workers whose faces had gone slack with exhaustion. The air was thick enough to chew, heavy with cotton lint that coated lungs and shortened lives. Some workers lasted 20 years in the mill. Most lasted 10. The children, and there were always children, some as young as 7, often didn't survive to adulthood, their small bodies crushed by machinery or consumed by lung disease or simply worn down to nothing by the relentless grind of production. Ezekiel moved through this landscape of industrial suffering with the ease of long familiarity, heading toward the second floor where 2 more windows awaited his attention. His tool bag felt heavier than usual, weighted not just with hammers and nails but with the knowledge of what those tools were building toward. In 18 days, he would seal window number 43. In 22 days, at midnight under a moonless sky, Dunridge Mill would transform from a prison into something far more terrible. A trap. A tomb. A statement written in nails and sealed windows and the architecture of vengeance. Ezekiel began climbing the stairs to the second floor, counting his steps as he counted everything, heartbeats, lashes, days until December 3rd. Behind him, the mill roared its endless hunger, unaware that its own structure was being slowly, methodically turned against its masters. Unaware that its carpenter had learned to build more than furniture and repair more than walls. Ezekiel Crane had learned to build coffins large enough to hold an entire world. November died in frost and whispered promises, and with it died any lingering illusion that Ezekiel Crane was merely a carpenter doing routine repairs. By the 28th day of November, he had sealed 60 windows. 60 panes of glass transformed into permanent barriers, 60 potential escape routes eliminated with surgical precision. The mill now resembled a fortress turned inward, its windows no longer portals to the outside world but decorative falsehoods, transparent walls that offered the illusion of openness while guaranteeing entrapment. Ezekiel worked with the focused intensity of a man building his own monument. Each nail he drove became a meditation on suffering accumulated over 31 years of bondage. The window on the second floor near the carding machines, that one was for the time chrism had struck him across the face for requesting water during a 14-hour shift. The 3 windows on the eastern wall of the third floor, those were for the children he had watched die in the machinery, their small bodies mangled by gears and drive shafts while overseers calculated the financial loss rather than the human cost. The window overlooking the punishment post in the courtyard, that one he sealed with particular care, driving the nails deeper than necessary, as if he could nail shut the memory of every whipping, every scream, every moment of calculated cruelty he had witnessed from that vantage point. His hands bore the evidence of his obsession. Calluses had formed on calluses. His fingers moved with mechanical efficiency even in sleep, Delphine reported, watching him from her pallet in the quarters as his hands twitched through the motions of hammering invisible nails into invisible frames. "You're becoming the thing you're building," she told him one evening as they sat in the narrow space behind the cotton press where conversations could be held without overhead ears. A man sealed shut. Windows all nailed closed from the inside. Ezekiel said nothing, running his thumb along the handle of his favorite hammer, a tool he had owned for 12 years, its hickory handle worn smooth by constant use, its head perfectly balanced for maximum striking force with minimum effort. The hammer knew his hand as well as his hand knew the hammer. They were partners in this architectural conspiracy. "Tell me why you learned carpentry," Delphine pressed. "Tell me about before." So Ezekiel told her, his voice low and measured, about Charleston and Solomon Hayes and the workshop that smelled of fresh-cut pine and linseed oil. He told her about learning to read wood grain like scripture, about understanding that every piece of timber had a story locked in its rings, years of growth, seasons of drought, the memory of wind and sun and rain all encoded in the patterns of light and dark. He told her about the first dovetail joint he had cut perfectly, how Solomon had examined it with critical eyes before nodding approval, saying, "That joint will outlast both of us, boy. That's immortality in wood." Solomon believed carpentry was about creating things that endured, Ezekiel said, his hands still moving across the hammer handle in unconscious patterns. About building furniture and homes that would serve families for generations. He said a good carpenter leaves the world better than he found it, one joint at a time. And now? Delphine asked quietly. What are you leaving? A coffin, Ezekiel replied without hesitation. The finest coffin ever built. One that holds an entire system of suffering. One that seals shut not just windows but the men who profit from human misery. Solomon was wrong about one thing: sometimes the best thing you can build is something that brings an ending rather than a beginning. Delphine's bent fingers reached out and stilled his restless hands. Just make sure you don't seal yourself inside your own creation. Make sure when December 3rd comes, you remember there's still a door you can walk through. But Ezekiel was not certain he believed in doors anymore. He believed in walls and nails and the structural integrity of vengeance. The next morning, he began work on what he privately called his modifications, changes to the mill's interior that went beyond merely sealing windows. He reinforced certain doors with additional hinges and strike plates, making them impossible to break down quickly. He weakened other doors, creating intentional failure points that would collapse under pressure, blocking corridors and creating bottlenecks. He adjusted the spacing of support beams in the stairwells, narrowing passages so that only one person could move through at a time. To any observer, he was simply maintaining an aging structure. In reality, he was choreographing disaster, designing the mill's interior architecture to control the flow of human traffic when chaos inevitably erupted. Bartholomew Grissom noticed the door modifications during his afternoon rounds on the 29th. He stood in the second-floor hallway, running his hand along the reinforced door frame that led to the spinning room, his brow furrowed in thought. This seems excessive, Crane, Grissom said, his voice carrying its usual edge of suspicion. Why does a door need 6 hinges when 3 would do? Building settling, sir, Ezekiel replied, his eyes fixed on the floor in the posture of deference he had perfected. These old frames are pulling away from the walls. Extra support keeps the doors hanging true, prevents them binding up when workers need to move cotton through in a hurry. Grissom grunted, apparently satisfied. He was a man who understood violence and profit margins but had little patience for structural engineering. If the carpenter said doors needed reinforcement, then doors needed reinforcement. The fact that those reinforcements would make the doors nearly impossible to break through from the opposite direction never occurred to him. After Grissom left, Ezekiel allowed himself the smallest smile, a brief crack in his usually impassive expression. The overseer had just approved his own imprisonment, nodding along while Ezekiel explained away the bars being built around him. That evening, the inner circle met again in the basement. Augustus Pendleton had joined them, a 67-year-old man who had spent 5 decades in bondage and carried the weight of those years in his bent spine and clouded eyes. He listened to the plan with the patient attention of someone who had seen revolts before and knew their usual ending. You're all going to die, Augustus said when they finished explaining. His voice held no malice, only the flat certainty of experience. Maybe you take Dunridge and his overseers with you, maybe you don't. But you're going to die. That's what happens when enslaved people rise up. They bring in militia. They bring in dogs. They make examples that other plantations can see and fear. Then we die free, Josiah rumbled, his massive hands clenched into fists. Better than dying piece by piece in these machines. Free. Augustus shook his head slowly. Boy, you'll be just as dead. Dead is dead, whether you're free or not when it happens. He's right to be afraid, Miriam said, though her voice held no judgment. We should all be afraid. Fear means we understand the stakes. I'm not afraid, Tobias cut in, his young face hardened by determination. I'm terrified. But I'm more terrified of spending the next 40 years as property. Of watching my children, if I ever have children, grow up in chains. Of dying having never made a single choice that mattered. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Is there truly freedom in choosing how you die, even if escape is impossible? Augustus studied each of their faces in the candlelight, then sighed with the weight of decades. You're going to do this regardless of what I say. So I'll tell you what I can. The militia in Culleton County, they're poorly organized. If you move at midnight like you planned, it'll take them hours to mobilize. Maybe you get 6, 7 hours of head start before they even know something's happened. You'll come with us? Delphine asked. No, Augustus replied simply. I'm too old to run and too tired to fight. But I'll make sure the children are ready. Little Patience Wembley and the others, they need to be positioned near exits, need to know which way to go when the chaos starts. Someone has to think about them. Ezekiel felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or the recognition that his architectural vengeance would inevitably consume the innocent along with the guilty. The mill didn't discriminate in its structure. When he sealed windows, he sealed them for everyone. The children get out first, he heard himself say. When we lock down on December 3rd, we make sure every child is positioned near the main loading doors. They run before anything else happens. And if they're caught? Miriam asked quietly. No one answered. They all knew what happened to runaway slave children. They all knew the mathematics of cruelty that governed their world. The meeting dispersed, but Ezekiel remained in the basement, staring at the furnace. In 4 days, December will arrive. In 5 days, he would seal the final accessible windows. In 6 days, at midnight, the mill would transform from a prison into a tomb, and Ezekiel would discover whether Solomon Hayes had been right about carpentry being an act of creation or whether it could also be an act of divine destruction. He thought about doors and windows, about how architecture controlled movement and possibility. A door was an invitation. A window was a promise of elsewhere. But sealed windows and reinforced doors were something different. They were statements about inevitability, about inescapability, about systems so strong they became part of the landscape itself. Ezekiel Crane was building a landscape of vengeance, and in 4 days, everyone at Dunridge Mill would live, or die, within its carefully constructed borders. December 3rd arrived wrapped in darkness so complete it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. No moon hung in the Carolina sky. No stars penetrated the thick cloud cover that had rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing with it the promise of winter rain. The darkness was absolute, oppressive, suffocating, the kind of darkness that erased boundaries between earth and sky, between the living and the soon-to-be dead. Inside Dunridge Mill, 143 looms continued their eternal clatter, tended by workers whose faces had gone numb with exhaustion and anticipation. Those who knew what was coming moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, hands working while minds counted down the hours. Those who remained ignorant simply endured, as they endured every night, waiting for the shift change that would release them to the quarters for 5 hours of fitful sleep before the cycle began again. Ezekiel stood at his workbench in the corner workshop, staring at the architectural drawings he had created over the past month. 63 windows sealed. Every door was reinforced or strategically weakened. Every exit point mapped and prepared for lockdown. The mill had become a puzzle box of his own design, and at midnight, he would solve it in blood and smoke. His hands trembled, the first time they had done so in 16 years. He gripped the edge of the workbench until the trembling stopped, until his fingers remembered their purpose and his mind cleared of everything except the task ahead. 11:47. 13 minutes until midnight. Throughout the mill, the conspirators moved into position. Josiah Thorne descended to the machine room in the basement, where the great steam engine that powered the mill's drive shafts hammered its regular rhythm. He carried with him 3 hammers, 2 iron pry bars, and a determination that had calcified into something harder than the tools he held. His task was to control the engine, to keep the machinery running or silence it forever, depending on how events unfolded. Miriam Blackwell slipped through the shadows of the main house, moving with the practiced invisibility of a servant who had learned to become furniture in the presence of white eyes. She carried 2-gallon jugs of lamp oil stolen from the storage room, their weight pulling at her shoulders as she made her way toward the mill's loading dock. Behind her, in the parlor, Temperance Dunridge sat reading by candlelight, unaware that her chambermaid was ferrying the instruments of her destruction. Tobias Ashford gathered the children on the first floor near the loading dock doors, 13 souls between the ages of 7 and 14, including little Patience Wembley, whose left hand had been crushed in a loom 2 years prior and now hung twisted and useless. He spoke to them in urgent whispers, explaining that when the doors opened, they were to run toward Crowley's Creek, toward the pine forest, toward the Quaker family named Harrison who would hide them in false-bottomed wagons and spirit them north. Don't look back, Tobias told them, his hands on Patience's thin shoulders. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you run and you don't look back. You understand? Patience nodded, her eyes huge in her gaunt face. What about Mama? Your mama wants you free more than she wants anything else in this world, Tobias said gently. You run for her. You survive for her. Delphine Merriweather stood at her loom, number 47, 3rd row from the north wall, and waited. Her bent fingers rested on the shuttle, but her eyes tracked the mill's interior, marking the positions of overseers and watching the clock mounted on the west wall as its hands crept toward midnight. She had lived 42 years in bondage. In 13 minutes, she would either die enslaved or die fighting. There was a kind of peace in that clarity. 11:53. 7 minutes. Bartholomew Grissom made his rounds on the second floor, whip coiled at his belt, satisfaction radiating from him like heat from a stove. Production numbers for November had exceeded quotas. Silas Dunridge had praised his management. There would be a bonus, perhaps even a partnership stake if the mill continued its profitable trajectory. Grissom walked past 3 sealed windows without seeing them, his mind already calculating December's projected output. On the 3rd floor, in his private office overlooking the mill floor, Silas Dunridge himself sat reviewing ledgers. The numbers pleased him. Cotton prices remained stable. Labor costs were minimal, feed the slaves enough to keep them working, house them barely enough to keep them alive, and the profit margins were extraordinary. He had recently calculated that each enslaved worker at the mill generated approximately $400 in annual profit. Multiply that by 57 workers, and Dunridge Mill was a magnificent machine for converting human suffering into American currency. He glanced out his office window, one of the few windows Ezekiel had deliberately left unsealed, and felt a surge of proprietorial pride. This was his kingdom. His empire. His legacy. 11:58. 2 minutes. Ezekiel left his workshop and moved through the mill floor with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew every inch of the structure. He carried a hammer in his right hand and a leather bag of iron spikes in his left. As he walked, he nodded to the conspirators stationed throughout the building, small gestures of acknowledgement that their moment had arrived. He reached the main entrance and found Josiah already there, having ascended from the basement. The massive man held an iron bar across his chest like a staff of office. "The engine?" Ezekiel asked. "Bank the fires," Josiah replied. "Give it 15 minutes and the drive shafts will stop. The looms will fall silent. Then they'll know something's wrong." Ezekiel nodded. Silence would be their announcement. After decades of machinery's constant thunder, the absence of sound would scream louder than any human voice. 11:59. 1 minute. Throughout the mill, the workers who knew began to still. Hands that had been feeding cotton into hungry machines now withdrew. Bodies that had been bent in service to production now straightened. 57 enslaved souls, 43 of whom understood what was about to happen, prepared themselves for transformation, from property into actors, from sufferers into agents of their own fate. The clock struck midnight. Josiah moved first. He slammed the iron bar through the handles of the main entrance doors and drove a spike through the bar, anchoring it to the frame. The doors, the primary entrance and exit for the entire mill, were now locked from the inside. Sealed shut by the same carpenter who had sealed 63 windows. Throughout the building, other conspirators moved to secondary exits, driving spikes through door handles, wedging iron bars across frames, transforming every escape route into a dead end. In 90 seconds, Dunridge Mill went from a building with 7 exits to a building with none. The machinery began to slow as the steam engine's power faded. The loom's clatter diminished, replaced by an eerie winding down sound like a giant music box losing tension. Workers looked up from their stations, confused, frightened, unsure whether this was malfunction or something more sinister. On the 2nd floor, Bartholomew Grissom heard the silence growing and felt the first prickle of alarm. He moved toward the stairs, his hand dropping to the whip at his belt. "What's happening? Who stopped the engine?" He never reached the stairs. Josiah Thorne emerged from the shadows and struck him across the face with the iron bar, a blow that sent teeth flying and dropped the overseer to his knees. Blood poured from Grissom's ruined mouth as he stared up at the massive man standing over him, comprehension finally dawning in his eyes. "You," Grissom managed through broken teeth. "You're all free," Josiah finished. "For the next few hours, we're free. And you're trapped." On the 3rd floor, Silas Dunridge heard the machinery die and rose from his desk, irritation crossing his features. He moved to his office door and found it sealed shut from the outside, iron spikes driven through the handle, rendering it immobile. He threw his weight against the door and it didn't budge. Ezekiel's reinforcements held perfectly. "Open this door," Dunridge shouted. "Open it now or I'll have every one of you whipped until the flesh falls from your bones." No one answered. The mill had fallen silent except for Dunridge's increasingly panicked shouting. Ezekiel stood in the center of the first floor, surrounded by workers who were beginning to understand what had happened. The children had been released through the loading dock, the only exit that had been opened and immediately resealed after they fled into the night. Now only the adults remained, trapped inside with their masters, the sealed windows surrounding them like the walls of a tomb. "We have a choice," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying through the unnatural silence. "We can leave, break through the loading dock and run. Or we can stay. We can ensure that Dunridge and Chrism never brutalize another soul. That this mill never grinds another person into dust. The sealed windows mean they can't escape. The architecture itself has become our weapon." Delphine moved to stand beside him, her bent hands folded together. "And if we stay? If we see this through?" Ezekiel looked up at the sealed windows, at the doors reinforced and spiked shut, at the building he had spent a month transforming into a trap. "Then we make sure they remember us. Make sure Dunridge Mill becomes a warning rather than a model." If this story has gripped you, subscribe and comment below, but steel yourself, for the true horror is yet to come. From the third floor, Silas Dunridge's screaming intensified. The smell of lamp oil began to spread through the first floor, pungent and promising. And in the basement, smoke started to rise from the cotton storage area, curling upward through the floorboards like the fingers of judgment reaching up from hell itself. The revolt had begun. The coffin was sealed. And Ezekiel Crane stood at its center, hammer still gripped in his hand, the architect of vengeance watching his dark masterpiece come to life. The smoke arrived like an unwelcome truth, slowly at first, then all at once. It seeped through the floorboards of the first level, thin wisps that curled upward in the darkness, carrying with them the acrid smell of burning cotton and lamp oil. Within minutes, those wisps became tendrils, then streams, then a gray fog that spread through the mill's interior with purposeful malevolence, seeking every corner, filling every space, transforming the air itself into an instrument of suffocation. Ezekiel watched the smoke rise and felt something inside him crack, not break entirely, but develop a fissure through which doubt began to seep. This was his design. His architecture of vengeance. But standing in the thickening haze, listening to the first sounds of panic from the workers around him, he wondered if Solomon Hayes would recognize what his apprentice had become. "The loading dock," Tobias shouted, coughing as smoke invaded his lungs. "We need to open it now, before the smoke gets worse." "No." Delphine's voice cut through the growing chaos. "Not yet. Not until we're certain Dunridge and Chrism can't escape." On the second floor, Bartholomew Chrism crawled toward the stairs, his face a mask of blood and terror. Josiah had left him there, broken-toothed and whimpering, while he moved to secure the stairwell. Chrism's hands scrabbled at the wooden planks as he pulled himself forward, his mind unable to comprehend how his world had inverted so completely in the span of minutes. He reached the top of the stairs and found his path blocked by 3 enslaved men holding iron bars and hammers. Men whose names he had never bothered to learn, whose bodies he had brutalized with casual regularity, now stood between him and escaped. "Please," Chrism managed, blood bubbling from his lips. "I have money. I can pay you. I can help you run." "We don't want your money," one of the men said, a field hand named Nathaniel Cross who bore whip scars across his entire back. "We want you to understand what it feels like. To be trapped. To have no choices. To know you're going to die and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Chrism tried to stand, but Nathaniel's boot caught him in the chest and sent him sprawling backward. The overseer lay on the second-floor landing, smoke beginning to gather around him, his breath coming in wet gasps through his ruined mouth. 3 floors above, Silas Dunridge had given up shouting and now threw his weight against his office door with the desperate strength of a man who finally understood that his money and status meant nothing to walls and nails and architectural inevitability. The door, reinforced by Ezekiel's careful modifications, absorbed his impacts without yielding. Through the window, one of the few unsealed panes, Dunridge could see the darkness outside, could see freedom mere inches away on the other side of glass. He grabbed his desk chair and hurled it at the window. The chair bounced off without breaking anything. The glass was old, thick, set deep in its frame. He would need tools, time, neither of which he possessed. Temperance Dunridge appeared in the doorway of their private residence adjacent to the mill, drawn by her husband's screams. She wore her nightdress, her hair in curling papers, her face painted with the cold cream she applied each evening to preserve her complexion. Silas? What's happening? Why are you shouting? She never finished the question. Miriam Blackwell emerged from the shadows behind her, and for the first time in her life, Temperance Dunridge looked into the eyes of her chambermaid and saw not a servant but a human being vibrating with accumulated rage. You're going to die tonight, Miriam said quietly. I wanted you to know that. I want you to understand that the hands that made your bed and pressed your dresses and endured your casual cruelty are the hands that helped seal every window in this building. Temperance opened her mouth to scream, but Miriam's hand clamped over it. No. You don't get to scream. We screamed for years and no one heard us. You die quietly. On the first floor, the smoke had thickened to the point where visibility dropped to mere feet. Workers stumbled through the gray fog, coughing, crying, some calling out for loved ones, others simply trying to find clean air that no longer existed. The sealed windows that surrounded them on all sides reflected only darkness and desperate faces pressed against glass that would never open. Ezekiel moved through the chaos toward the loading dock, where Delphine stood guard over the one exit they had left unsealed. The iron bar that secured it could be removed in seconds, allowing escape into the night. But Delphine's bent fingers remained wrapped around that bar, her face set with grim determination. Let them out, Ezekiel said, his voice hoarse from smoke. The workers who want to run, let them go. Not yet, Delphine insisted. Chrism is still alive. Dunridge is still. They're trapped, Ezekiel interrupted, gripping her shoulders. The architecture has done its work. Chrism can't reach the stairs, and Dunridge is sealed in his office. We've won. Now let our people choose whether to stay or run. Delphine studied his face through the smoke, seeing something in his eyes that made her slowly nod. She released the iron bar. Anyone who wants out, move to the loading dock now, Ezekiel shouted, his voice barely carrying over the sounds of coughing and panic. We're opening the way. The response was immediate. Workers surged toward the loading dock, a desperate tide of humanity seeking the promise of clean air and escape. Josiah appeared from the second floor, supporting an elderly woman named Claudia Vance who could barely walk. Behind him came others, some wounded, some simply terrified, all moving toward the one door that offered salvation. Ezekiel and Josiah lifted the bar together and pushed the loading dock doors open. Cold December air rushed in, momentarily clearing the smoke near the entrance. Workers poured through the opening like water breaching a dam, stumbling into the darkness beyond, running toward the pine forest and the promise of freedom or death in the attempt. Within 5 minutes, 31 people had fled into the night. 26 remained behind, some too injured to move quickly, some choosing to stay and bear witness, some simply unable to make the decision to abandon what they knew for the terrifying uncertainty of escape. Augustus Pendleton was among those who stayed. The elderly man sat on the floor near the cotton press, his back against the wall, watching the smoke gather overhead. I told you, he said to no one in particular. I told you how this would end. Delphine knelt beside him. You should go. You could still make it. I'm 67 years old with lungs full of cotton dust, Augustus replied with a sad smile. I wouldn't make it 50 yards. Besides, someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to remember what happened here tonight. On the second floor, the smoke had grown dense enough that Bartholomew Chrism could no longer see his own hands. He crawled in what he hoped was the direction of windows, but every window he found was sealed shut, nailed with such precision that his bleeding fingers couldn't find purchase to pry them open. His whip lay somewhere in the darkness, useless now, a symbol of authority that had evaporated like morning dew. He thought about the men he had whipped, the women he had violated, the children he had worked to death in the machinery below. He thought about Cyrus Whitlock's 37 lashes for the crime of 3 seconds of eye contact. He thought about how he had never once considered these people human, and had never once questioned his right to brutalize them. Now, in the smoke-filled darkness, choking on the consequences of his own cruelty, Bartholomew Chrism finally understood what it meant to have no power, no choices, no hope of mercy. He died alone on the second floor, his lungs filled with smoke and his conscience arriving too late to save him. In his office, Silas Dunridge had managed to crack the window glass using a brass letter opener, but the window frame itself, sealed with Ezekiel's nails, remained immobile. Fresh air trickled through the cracks in the glass, just enough to keep him conscious, just enough to prolong his suffering as smoke gathered in the room around him. Through the cracked window, he could see the mill workers fleeing into the darkness. He could see his empire dissolving, his fortune burning, his legacy transforming into a cautionary tale about what happens when men treat other men as machinery. "Please," he whispered to the empty room. "Please, I'll free them all. I'll sign the papers. I'll." But there was no one to hear his promises. The sealed room had become his confessional, and the smoke was his only witness. On the first floor, Ezekiel stood at the open loading dock, watching the last of the fleeing workers disappear into the darkness. Behind him, the mill burned with increasing intensity, the fire feeding on decades of accumulated cotton lint and timber dried by years of machinery heat. "We should go," Josiah said, his massive hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "The building won't hold much longer." But Ezekiel couldn't move. He stared at the structure he had transformed, at the sealed windows reflecting firelight, at the architecture of vengeance he had spent a month creating. Solomon Hayes's voice echoed in his memory, "A building remembers what you put into it." Dunridge Mill would remember Ezekiel Crane. Would remember the carpenter who had turned his craft into an instrument of terrible justice. Would stand as a monument to the reality that oppression, when sealed tight enough, eventually suffocates everyone inside. "Ezekiel," Delphine's voice cut through his reverie. "We need to leave. Now." He turned away from his creation and followed her into the December darkness, leaving behind the burning mill and the sealed tomb it had become. Dawn arrived like a judge rendering a verdict, cold and impartial and absolute. The sun rose over the smoldering remains of Dunridge Mill, illuminating a skeleton of blackened timber and collapsed walls. The four-story structure had burned through the night, its sealed windows exploding outward from internal pressure only after the flames had consumed everything inside. Now it stood as a monument to destruction, walls reduced to waist-high ruins, the great steam engine visible through the wreckage like the exposed bones of some industrial leviathan, drive shafts twisted into abstract sculptures by heat that had reached infernal temperatures. Smoke still rose from the ruins, thin gray columns that ascended into the December morning and dissipated among the clouds. The smell of burned cotton and charred timber hung over the plantation like a funeral shroud. Ezekiel Crane watched the sunrise from a position 2 miles distant, hidden in a copse of pine trees near Crowley's Creek. He had run through the night with the others, his lungs burning from smoke inhalation, his hands blistered from the heat of the loading dock doors he had held open while workers fled past him. Around him, 23 souls huddled together, the survivors of Dunridge Mill's final night. 23 out of 57. 34 had remained behind, either by choice or inability to flee. Augustus Pendleton. Delphine Merriweather. Nathaniel Cross. Names that Ezekiel had known, faces he had worked beside, people who had chosen to stay and bear witness rather than run. Delphine had died ensuring Bartholomew Grissom couldn't break through the loading dock door when he had finally crawled down from the second floor, his face a mask of blood and desperation. She had held that door shut with her bent, ruined hands while Grissom beat against it from the inside, screaming for mercy he had never shown others. The smoke had taken her before the flames did, a small mercy in a night devoid of them. "She saved us," Josiah said quietly, standing beside Ezekiel among the pines. "Hold that door until we can get the last of the children clear." Grissom would have followed us out, and would have raised the alarm. She knew that. Ezekiel said nothing. His throat felt lined with ash and guilt in equal measure. Little Patience Wembley sat nearby, her twisted hand cradled against her chest, her eyes enormous in her gaunt face. She had not spoken since fleeing the mill. Neither had most of the children. They simply sat in the cold morning, wrapped in whatever blankets the Quaker family, the Harrisons, had provided when the refugees reached their farm 3 hours before dawn. The Harrisons had been prepared. They had false-bottomed wagons, provisions, maps of safe houses stretching north toward Pennsylvania. They asked no questions about the orange glow visible on the southern horizon, about the smell of smoke that clung to everyone's clothes, about the haunted looks in the refugees' eyes. "You'll need to scatter," Joshua Harrison had told them, his plain Quaker face grave in the lamplight. "Travel in groups no larger than 4. The militia will be searching, and 23 people together will be impossible to hide. We'll get you to safe houses, but you must trust the network and follow instructions exactly." The group had divided shortly after. Josiah led one contingent north toward Charlotte. Tobias Ashford took the children and 3 women toward a safe house in Columbia. Others dispersed in different directions, each carrying their trauma into an uncertain future. Ezekiel remained behind with 2 others, a field hand named Marcus Webb and a woman named Grace Littleton who had worked in the mill's carding room. They would travel last, after the initial search parties had passed through the area. "You should rest," Joshua Harrison told Ezekiel, noting the way the carpenter's hands trembled, the way his breathing came shallow and labored. "Your lungs took in a lot of smoke." But Ezekiel couldn't rest. He stood at the edge of the pines, staring toward where Dunridge Mill had stood, watching the smoke rise from his architectural confession. 3 months later, Ezekiel died in a safe house outside of Richmond, Virginia. His lungs, damaged beyond repair by smoke inhalation, simply gave out on a cold March evening. He was attended by a freed black doctor named William Pemberton, who recorded in his diary that the dying man's last words were, "Count them. Count the nails." Dr. Pemberton didn't understand the reference, but he dutifully recorded it, along with the deceased's name and approximate age. The body was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery that served Richmond's free black community. No marker identified the resting place of the carpenter who had transformed a textile mill into a tomb. The official record of the Dunridge Mill fire, compiled by South Carolina authorities, told a different story entirely. According to testimony from neighboring plantation owners and surviving white witnesses, the fire had been an accident, a spark from the steam engine igniting accumulated cotton lint in the storage areas. The enslaved workers had panicked, the report stated, and in their confusion had barred the doors and trapped themselves inside. The death of Silas Dunridge, his wife Temperance, overseer Bartholomew Grissom, and second overseer Amos Pritchard were recorded as tragic losses. The 34 enslaved people who perished were listed by name in a property loss ledger, their combined value calculated at $27,400. The 23 who escaped were listed as runaways, rewards posted for their capture. Most were never found. They disappeared into the network of safe houses and sympathetic families that spirited fugitives north, their names changing, their histories rewritten, their pasts becoming stories they would tell their children in hushed voices decades later. But among the abolitionist communities of the North, a different version of the story circulated. Tobias Ashford, who successfully reached Pennsylvania and learned to set type in a print shop, recorded the true account in a pamphlet published in 1837. He titled it, "The Sealed Windows, a True Account of Resistance at Dunridge Mill." In Tobias's telling, Ezekiel Crane emerged as a figure of terrible complexity, neither hero nor villain, but something more troubling. A man who had used his gifts as a craftsman to create an instrument of vengeance that killed the guilty and innocent alike. A man who had transformed architecture itself into a weapon, proving that the same skills used to build shelter could be employed to construct coffins. The pamphlet circulated quietly among abolitionist circles, reprinted in small batches, always with the understanding that it was inflammatory material that could bring legal consequences to anyone caught distributing it. Some readers saw Ezekiel as a martyr. Others saw him as a cautionary tale about how oppression corrupts everything it touches, turning even the oppressed into architects of destruction. The ruins of Dunridge Mill were never rebuilt. The land remained empty, the collapsed walls slowly overtaken by kudzu and wild growth. Local people avoided the site, claiming they heard sounds on quiet nights, the rhythmic percussion of hammering, the screech of nails being driven through resistant wood, the ghost of a carpenter still sealing windows against an escape that would never come. In 1852, a journalist from Charleston visited the ruins and wrote a sensational article titled, "The Haunted Mill of Culleton County." The article repeated local legends that had grown around the site, stories of sealed windows that could still be seen glowing in moonlight, of smoke that rose from the foundations on December 3 each year, of voices calling out from beneath the rubble. The article made no mention of slavery or revolt. It treated the mill as merely another Southern Gothic curiosity, a spooky ruin suitable for frightening children and entertaining tourists. The systematic brutalization that had occurred within those walls, the architectural vengeance enacted by a carpenter whose name the journalist never learned, all of it was reduced to atmosphere, to mood, to the vague sense that something terrible had happened here once upon a time. Patience Wembley, the little girl with the crushed hand, lived to be 73 years old. She made it to Canada, married a freed man named Thomas Douglas, and bore 4 children who never knew bondage. On her deathbed in 1887, she told her grandchildren about the night she fled Dunridge Mill, about the carpenter who had sealed the windows, about Delphine Merriweather who had held the door shut so children could escape. Was he a good man? One grandchild asked. This carpenter? Patience considered the question for a long moment, her twisted hand folded against her chest as it had been that December night 53 years earlier. He was a man who turned his prison into his weapon, she finally said. Whether that makes him good or bad, I don't know. But I know I'm free because of what he built, and I know evil men died because of it. Maybe that's the only judgment that matters. She died 3 days later, the last living witness to the night Dunridge mill burned. The sealed windows remained in memory long after the physical structure collapsed into ruin. They became a metaphor in abolitionist literature, a symbol of how slavery trapped everyone inside its architecture, master and slave alike, creating a system so sealed against escape that only fire could cleanse it. And in quiet moments, in safe houses and freed communities scattered across the North, people who had known Ezekiel Crane or heard his story would pause in their work and imagine they heard it, the sound of a hammer driving nails through wood, the rhythm steady and methodical and inevitable, the sound of a carpenter building something that would outlast them all. A coffin large enough to hold an entire world. A statement written in sealed windows and calculated vengeance. A dark legacy that asked a question no one could fully answer: when justice is impossible, is vengeance the only architecture left? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Was Ezekiel's vengeance justice, or did he cross a line that can never be uncrossed? This dark chapter of history demands we remember.